When I first heard about this fella, I couldn't believe it. So I looked him up. Still couldn't believe it. This fella took more punishment than John McClane in Die Hard. He's a bona fide super soldier. The real Rambo. Today we're going to talk about the one and only Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez.
I didn't think too much of it then.
I don't care what other people think.
Really was coming from my face, pure and there.
Never in the field of human conscience was so much owed by so many to so few.
By the content of their character.
Where did we get such men? At the going down of the sun, we will remember them.
Raul Perez Benavidez, better known as Roy Benavidez, was born on the 5th of August 1935 in a place called Lindendale in DeWitt County, Texas. His parents were Mexican farmer Salvador Benavidez Jr. and his wife Teresa Perez. When Roy was only 2 years of age, his father died of tuberculosis. His mother would eventually remarry, but tragically she too would die of tuberculosis only 5 years later. Roy and his younger brother Roger moved to El Campo, Texas, to live with their grandfather, uncle and aunt, where they would be raised alongside 8 cousins. Similar to his hero Audie Murphy, Benavidez dropped out of school at the age of 15 so he could help support his family. To earn money, he shined shoes at a local bus station, worked on farms, picked cotton, and gained full-time employment at a tire station in El Campo. He would enlist in the Texas Army National Guard in 1952 while the Korean War was in full swing. He was only 17 years of age. In June of 1955 he switched to Army active duty. By 1959 Benavidez had married Hilary Coy, and with a potential family on the way he decided that the extra pay that came along with jumping out of an aeroplane was a good idea. He completed his airborne training at Fort Benning, Georgia that same year, and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He wasn't long with the Airborne before returning to training for the Green Berets. Once accepted, he was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group and also the Studies and Observation Group. Roy Benavidez was trained in operations and intelligence, interrogation and linguistics, and light and heavy weapons. He was also cross-trained as a medic. In 1965, Benavidez was sent to South Vietnam as Special Forces Advisor to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. While on patrol, he stepped on a landmine and was seriously injured. He woke up in Clark Air Force Base on the Philippine Islands in severe pain. Eventually, he was evacuated to Fort Sam Houston in the United States, where doctors concluded that his injuries were so extreme he would never walk again. Preparations for his medical discharge were thus initiated. This diagnosis devastated Benavidez, and the anti-US military stance propagated by the media on TV and the anti-American sentiment of the flag-burning hippies deeply enraged him to the point where he resolved to walk out of that hospital and return to his duties in Vietnam. Against doctors' orders, Benavidez would carry out nocturnal training missions that involved crawling out of his bed, dragging himself along the floor using only his chin and elbows until he could prop his back up against a wall and try to push himself up with his legs. At first he couldn't even move his toes, but eventually with dogged perseverance his toes started to wiggle, then his feet, and after months of persistent practice that oftentimes brought him to tears, he was eventually able to push himself up against the wall and stand up using his legs. Throughout his long suffering, the words of his own Master Sergeant stuck in his head. Benavidez, quitters never win and winners never quit. What one are you? During this arduous process, his fellow patients constantly supported him, many of whom were permanently paralysed themselves or missing their limbs altogether. After a year in hospital, Benavidez's doctor finally came to him with his discharge papers. Benavidez argued with the doctor and insisted that he was still fit for duty. He argued until the doctor finally relented and made a deal with him. The deal was that if Benavidez could walk himself out of the hospital unaided, he would tear up his discharge papers. To the doctor's amazement, Benavidez stood up out of his wheelchair and with his wife by his side walked out the door. He had a limp and was in agonizing pain, but he didn't stop. The doctor was true to his word and tore up his discharge papers. Benavidez returned to Fort Bragg and resumed his therapy. He would run 5 to 10 miles a day and knock out 100 push-ups. When he was able to do 3 parachute jumps in one day, he knew he was fully fit to return to duty. Although still suffering considerable pain from his injuries, Roy Benavidez returned to South Vietnam in January of 1968. In the latter half of April, Benavidez and his friend were instructed to gather information behind enemy lines. After only 2 days on the ground, Benavidez's buddy got shot through the eye, the back and the legs. They completed their mission, but Benavidez didn't want to leave his seriously injured brother behind, so he called in an extraction helicopter to pull them out of enemy territory. Since they were in dense jungle, the rescue crew had to use what's called a Maguire rig to extract the men, as there was no place to land a chopper. The Maguire rig is basically a nylon strap at the end of a rope that gets lowered into the bush for the soldiers to wrap around themselves. Benavidez and his buddy roped up under heavy enemy fire and were pulled up through the canopy. As they were climbing, the ropes twisted and started to rub together. The problem here is that nylon starts to burn when it rubs. By the time they'd cleared the canopy, the men's ropes had become completely tangled and started to burn. Benavidez could do nothing about it except watch it happen. A non-commissioned officer happened to stick his head out of the helicopter and see that the ropes were tangled and smoking. Without hesitation, he tied a rope around himself and climbed out of the helicopter to untangle the men. This display of love for a brother in arms and of his country moved Benavidez, and he learned the NCO's name and always remembered his example. The helicopter made it back to safety, and Benavidez's buddy was transferred to hospital, where he later passed over. On May 2nd, 1968, 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team was surrounded by an NVA infantry battalion consisting of about 1,000 men west of Loch Ninh. Benavidez was at the forward operating base in Loch Ninh, monitoring the operation by radio, when helicopters of the 240th Assault Helicopter Company returned to offload wounded crew members and to assess aircraft damage. Over the radio, he heard loud popping sounds and cries for an immediate extraction. Benavidez asked the radio operator who was calling for rescue, but the men had given no call sign, so he didn't know. At that moment, Benavidez saw a helicopter pilot scrambling to the flight line. He ran after him to find a damaged helicopter incoming. He saw a door gunner slumped over his M60, and when the chopper landed, Benavidez rushed to the man and unstrapped him. That man turned out to be 19-year-old Spec 4 Michael Craig. They had just celebrated his 19th birthday that March. Benavidez cradled the young man and tried to comfort him, but he died in his arms. His last words were, "My God, my mother and father." Benavidez asked the pilot who the men on the ground were. The pilot told him, "That black NCO, the one who saved your life the other day, remember?" Benavidez answered, "Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright." Staff Sergeant Lloyd Massow and Spec 4 Brian O'Connor were also stranded with Wright. 2 men Benavidez also knew. So he instantly sprang into action, grabbing a medical pack that he'd seen lying on the ground and jumping on board the chopper that was about to head out for the men. He had no firearm and carried only a knife. The pilot contacted the Forward Air Control for guidance. Forward Air Control informed the men that they couldn't go in because the area was too hot. They went in anyway. Realizing that the remaining members of the stranded team were either dead or wounded and couldn't make it out to the pickup zone, Benavidez instructed the pilot to head to a nearby clearing, where he jumped from the hovering helicopter and ran through 75 meters of heavy fire in order to reach the besieged team. During this mad dash to his wounded brothers, he was shot in the right leg, face and head. But despite these harrowing injuries, Sergeant Benavidez took charge and repositioned his team to lay down cover fire for the extraction helicopters. He then popped smoke to notify the choppers of the team's position. When the choppers came in, despite his serious injuries, Benavidez carried or dragged half of the wounded team to the chopper himself and loaded them on board. He then provided protective cover fire by running alongside the helicopter as it moved in closer to collect the rest of the team. As the enemy increased their fire and moved in on the LZ, Sergeant Benavidez ran back into the fray to locate the dead team leader and to retrieve the classified documents that he'd been carrying. Benavidez was shot again in the abdomen, and an exploding grenade shredded his back with shrapnel. In the same moment, the pilot of the extraction chopper was mortally wounded by incoming fire, and his UE crashed into the jungle. Although Sergeant Benavidez was severely wounded, He managed to secure the classified documents and made his way over to the burning wreckage. When he arrived at the scene, he dragged out survivors of the crash from the overturned aircraft and organised them into a defensive perimeter. As the enemy fire increased and grenades started to rain down on them, Benavidez went around the perimeter doling out ammunition and water to the shell-shocked men. He roused them with encouragement and instilled in them the will to fight for their lives against the odds. Facing ever-increasing numbers of enemy troops and the spirits of his own men fading fast, Benavidez battled through his own seriously injured state to call in tactical airstrikes on the advancing forces, very reminiscent of his hero and fellow Texan Audie Murphy's actions. Benavidez also directed the gunships to target the areas where most of the enemy fire was coming from in an attempt to break the wall of fire long enough to permit another evac attempt. As the next extraction helicopter was coming in, Benavidez tended to a wounded member of his team and was hit again in the thigh by enemy fire. This didn't stop him from carrying the wounded to the chopper when it landed, however. On his second trip back to the helicopter, he was clubbed from behind by an enemy combatant and skewered by a bayonet. He received further wounds to his head and arms as his attacker clubbed him in the mouth with the butt of his rifle and broke his jaw. Benavidez engaged in hand-to-hand and managed to kill his opponent with his knife. His jaw, however, became locked and he was unable to speak from that point. Although he had suffered several serious wounds by this stage, Benavidez continued to carry other wounded brothers to the evac chopper, passing through an unceasing barrage of enemy fire each time. On his final run, Benavidez saw two enemy soldiers advancing and firing on the evac chopper from an angle that the door gunner couldn't return fire. He picked up an AK-47 from a fallen enemy and took out both of the advancing soldiers. With the last of the wounded men loaded aboard the chopper and bleeding heavily from his own gruesome injuries, Benavidez still managed to summon up some superhuman capability and went around the perimeter one more time to make sure all the classified material had been collected or destroyed and all the wounded had been secured. Only once he was certain that the job had been done would Benavidez return to the evac chopper and drag himself aboard, holding his own intestines in his hand. It's important to note that he'd been under fire the entire time. The chopper was overloaded with wounded, and as it lifted into the air, blood poured out both sides like a waterfall. Benavidez was all torn up. His jaw had locked into place and his eyelids were fused shut due to the hardened blood that had poured out of his head wound and run into his eyes. During the helicopter ride back to base, his condition worsened to the point where he couldn't even move or speak. When the chopper landed back at base, they began to unload the wounded. It was discovered that Benavidez had actually loaded 3 dead enemy soldiers onto the helicopter during the conflict. Such was his eagerness not to leave anyone behind. So the dead enemy soldiers were lined up to one side to be put in body bags. Since Benavidez could not move or speak and looked to be horrifically wounded, the crew unloading the wounded believed him to be dead. Benavidez also looked Asian, so he was thought to be another dead VC. Presumed dead, Benavidez was placed into a body bag. He could hear the men speaking but couldn't see them because his eyes were fused shut, and couldn't tell them he was still alive because he couldn't speak. He'd also lost so much blood that he was too weak to move. When he heard the zipper on the body bag being zipped up, he prayed to God. All of a sudden, the sergeant heard the voice of one of his friends, Jerry Cottingham, call out to the doctor zipping him up. "That's Benavidez! That's Roy Benavidez!" The doctor responded to his friend saying, "Sorry, but there's nothing I can do for him." Cottingham made the doctor check Roy for a heartbeat. When Benavidez felt the doctor's hand on his chest and felt him lean in close, he summoned up all the strength that he had left in his broken body and spat in the doctor's face. It was a 1 in a million shot, blind fire. The doctor immediately said, "I think you'll make it." In battle, Benavidez had sustained a total of 37 bullet, bayonet and shrapnel wounds from his 6 hours in hell. No man can survive this is beyond belief. And these weren't little pop gun rounds like 50 cent or something. These were 7.62mm rounds. He'd been shot in the head, face, neck, abdomen, legs, gutted by a bayonet, clubbed in the head, hit by shrapnel from multiple explosions, all in one engagement. The man was a Purple Heart pincushion. He'd run through unyielding fields of enemy fire to save other wounded men, and still lived. That is ordained by God. There's no other way around it. Benavidez was cleaned up and put on a medevac chopper alongside one of his buddies that he'd saved. He reached out for his buddy and he grabbed him by the hand in a tight grip. Not long after, his buddy's hand went limp. Benavidez still couldn't speak, but he knew his friend had just died, so he prayed to God for mercy. He asked God why he'd given him the strength to save those men, just to have them die on the way to getting fixed up. Upset by the loss of his friend, Benavidez started to cry and physically act out. He was moving around so much that the co-pilot became concerned that he was struggling to breathe and came back with a bayonet drawn to form an emergency trach on him. Benavidez felt him approach and nearly kicked him out of the helicopter. A while later, the helicopter landed at a hospital in Long Bin, and Benavidez was wheeled out, bound straight for the operating table. A nurse watching him coming in fell to her knees, asking God why he allowed this to happen. Benavidez looked to his left to see another brother lying on an operating table, with his arms and legs blown off. He then passed out. When he woke up again, he was lying in the ward. A buddy of his was lying next to him, but they were so bandaged up that they couldn't speak to each other. They had to resort to wiggling their toes to let each other know that they were still alive. Benavidez was quickly transferred to a hospital in Takikawa, Japan. En route, 2 more men died on the medevac plane. A nurse kept whispering into the sergeant's ear, "Benavidez, you're not going to die. You're not going to die. I'm going to pinch you every time you close your eyes." She was true to her word. By the time Benavidez got to the hospital, he was covered in purple and red welts. Soon after, Benavidez was shipped back to Fort Sam Houston, where he stayed in the Brooke Army Medical Center for the next year. He would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in battle, and 4 Purple Hearts for the serious injuries that he'd suffered. After getting out of hospital, he was assigned to Fort Riley, Kansas in 1969 until 1972, when he was transferred back to Fort Sam Houston, Texas. He would finish out his career there. Benavidez would retire in 1976 and move back to El Campo with his wife and 3 children. 3 years before his retirement in 1973, further details emerged about his actions in Vietnam. Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Ralph R. Drake insisted that Benavidez receive the Medal of Honor. Even though the time limit had expired, an appeal to Congress resulted in an exception being made for Sergeant Benavidez. But the Army Decorations Board denied him an upgrade of his Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor due to a lack of eyewitnesses. Even Benavidez believed that there was no surviving witnesses. But there was one who survived. Brian O'Connor, the former radio man of Benavidez's Special Forces team in Vietnam. Benavidez had thought him dead due to the severe injuries that he'd suffered, and O'Connor had been flown back stateside before the brass could even debrief him. As fate would have it, O'Connor had been living in the Fiji Islands when, while on holiday in Australia in 1980, he happened to read a newspaper account of Benavidez from an El Campo newspaper, which had been picked up by the international press and reprinted in Australia. What are the odds? O'Connor immediately contacted Benavidez and submitted a 10-page report of the encounter, confirming the accounts already provided by others. With an eyewitness now confirmed, Benavidez's Distinguished Service Cross was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. On February 24, 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor. During the presentation, Reagan turned to the press and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you wouldn't believe it." After his retirement, Benavidez dedicated the remainder of his life to the youth of America, advising that they stay in school and get an education. He would often declare, "An education is the key to success. Bad habits and bad company will ruin you." This was before the educational system became more about indoctrination rather than education, by the way. He was also an unashamedly proud veteran and American, and wasn't shy in telling anyone. He gave several speeches to his fellow vets and active duty servicemen. He always encouraged patriotism and pro-Americanism. He was a true advocate of the US military family, a true American hero. On November 29, 1998, at only 63 years of age, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez would leave this mortal realm in Brooke Army Medical Center at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The cause of his death was respiratory failure and complications from diabetes. His body was escorted to St. Robert Bellarmine Catholic Church, the same church he was married in, where his 3 children were married, and where he attended Mass every Sunday. His body was then returned to Fort Sam Houston's main chapel for public viewing. After the funeral, Benavidez was buried with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery, Texas. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez left behind a legacy of discipline, service, self-sacrifice, courage, honor, and just unbelievable toughness. What a story, the real Rambo. Thank you for your service and example, brave Sergeant. You have a fan here.
But let me also leave you with this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, since we're in tight crisis. You know, there's a saying among us veterans that it is those that have fought for it, that life has a special flavor that the protector will never know. You have never lived till you almost died. And it is us veterans, especially the wounded, that pray for peace most of all.